Hey everybody, welcome to the first part of the first chapter, evolution. This is kind of a overview of all the stuff we're going to study in biology. This is your book if you haven't got it yet, Campbell Biology. Stop by the bookstore and Shirley will fix you up. Okay, so when you're talking about biology, you're talking about things that occur in life. All right, things that we look at is how do living things adapt to the environment? Now, they say it's a result of evolution, and we'll talk more about that. But it's changing something so that they survive better, because the more they survive, the more they reproduce, the more of that substance you have. One substance we know that's very good at it is a dandelion. You can look at our yards in the spring, throughout the summer, in the fall, there's always dandelions. And what they've done is they have adapted the seeds so that the wind carries them away so they can spread all over. If they just drop their seeds right where they're at, the only place you'd have dandelions is, babies would be real close to mom, but instead they have those special seeds that'll fly in the wind and dandelions everywhere. Okay, so they call that evolution. It's changing something, transforming a life, and it's an adaptation so that they survive. Okay, if you're a biologist, you study life. Bio just means life. It's a Greek word or Latin word. Can't remember. Anyway, bios means this, and ology is the study of. So the study of life is biology. So if you're a biologist, you look at things and you might wonder, how does a single cell develop into an organism? Okay, sometimes a single cell is an organism and that's it. But you can take one cell, like we were at one time, we were a zygote, a fertilized egg, and it divided and divided and divided, and 9 months later you had a baby born that had all the characteristics of us, all from a single cell. How does the human mind work? That's something you can do if you're a biologist. It could be hormonal, it could be how the neurons fire, it could be how drugs affect the mind, things like that. How do living things interact in communities? You don't have just pods of organisms that don't interact. They all have to interact for food, for shelter, for all kinds of things. And then if you want to define life, defines a simple one sentence definition, not really. Life is a tough one. It's, what does to be alive mean? So, so the first part of your chapter talks about common themes, the study of life and the common themes. If you're studying biology, it's an enormous scope. I mean, some biologists just study fungus, some just study fish, some study birds, some study just single cells. I mean, there's so many things that you can study because if you look outside, look at all the things that are alive. Okay. There's 5 unifying themes if you're talking about biology. It's the general organization. How are the cells organized, or how are the groups organized, things like that. The information, how is it moved around in a organism? Energy and matter, how is energy used? How does it is to expand matter, things like that. The interactions in the groups, and then again evolution. So these are the 5 themes, and they're kind of what we'll cover. We'll cover them in more detail, but like I said, the first chapter just goes through them in general. Okay, so here we got some pictures. If you look at order of a sunflower, it's actually set up to get the most seeds possible in this area. And there's a pattern. That was the pattern that worked. I like this one. Look at this little seahorse. How he evolved to totally match the coral around him. If you're swimming by, there's no way you're going to see this. Okay. Regulation. You can see Mr. Big Ears here. He has huge ears to get rid of, dissipate the extra heat. This is in an area with a lot of heat, so he has huge ears to get rid of that. Processing energy, here you've got a critter taking in its energy, its food, and how does it use that? We've got growth and development. How do we respond to the environment? Here's a critter that's in there hiding, basically. You can't see it. And then here we have reproduction. So these are the themes, if you want to call them that, in biology. Okay. So when you're looking at biology, you start large. Here you have the biosphere. The biosphere is everything. All the living, and then we're talking everything, all living things in the earth. That's what biosphere means. There's the geosphere and the atmosphere and all that other stuff, but the biosphere is the living things. Okay, so now you take the biosphere and you break it into ecosystems. Okay, here's an ecosystem, kind of a lake, foresty type region. We have all kinds of ecosystems. We have deserts, we have plains, we have forests, we have, the ocean. But we can take the biosphere and break it into ecosystems. Then we take our ecosystem and we look at communities. Here we have a community, trees, and we got deer, and there's bugs, and there's, all the other things you can see around in here. There's more than one type of tree and so on. Then we can look at populations. So in this case, we broke it down to the trees. Okay. And then now we've got this population of trees. Let's look at one individual tree. That's an organism. Okay. Then we can break this organism and look at the parts to it. We've got stems, we've got roots, and we've got leaves. Okay. So they call that the organ and the organ systems. Okay. And I'm sorry you can't see this one in the corner because I'm in the way. But then there's tissues. So we can take this leaf and we can break it down into its parts. What's in this leaf? There's parenchyma cells and collenchyma cells and there's chlorophyll and all that kind of stuff. And then we can take and look at these tissues and break them down into the cells. Okay, so now we're looking specifically at a cell of a tree. And you can see all these green things. Those are chloroplasts. So now we got organelles. So even inside the cell, we had a little, they call them little organs. Organelles do like what our organs do, but on a much smaller scale. Because in a cell, you're going to have the nucleus, which is like the brain. You're going to have the chloroplasts that make food. You have something called lysosomes that break down waste. You got all kinds of stuff. So inside the cell, you got that. And then once we have these organelles, they're actually made out of molecules. And up to everything we can see. These last ones we can use a microscope to see, but when you get to this point, not going to really happen. Okay, unless we get really, really fancy microscopes, which we don't have at the college. Okay, so when we're looking at them, we look at what they call emergent properties, and that's a result of the arrangement of the parts of a system. Okay, they characterize non-biological entities as well. So when we're looking at that community, we've got trees. Well, trees don't survive unless they have dirt, and they don't survive if they don't have water. So there's all kinds of other non-biological entities that enter into this. Okay, here we have a functional bicycle as an example. Okay, it only works when you put everything together, and you got to put it together in the correct way. Okay, if you plant a tree seed in rocks, it's not going to grow. So you have to have all the different parts and the arrangements and the interactions have to be right in order for them to work. Okay, reductionism is when you take a complex system and you make it smaller into more manageable parts. So you want to study the moose. Well, before you can study the moose, maybe you have to study smaller parts of the moose, like maybe there's some sort of parasite that's invading the moose, and you're going to look at that parasite to see how it's affecting the moose population or something along those lines. Okay, another one we really want to get simple is studying the molecular structure of DNA. DNA, I'm sure you guys have heard of. DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. It's the basis for all life. It's the instructions to build you, okay? And there's a lot of people that's all they study is DNA. We didn't find the structure of DNA until the mid-50s, and they've done a lot with it since. Okay, and then we spent a lot of time talking about the cell. The cell is the smallest, the lowest level of organization. It can perform all the activities that are needed for life. Some organisms, that's all they are is one cell. An amoeba, a paramecium. Okay, they just one cell and that's it. Then we can start putting cells together and have different functions, and then we get organisms. We're made out of trillions of cells. But you can go down that lowest level of that cell and they have the job, like a blood cell. You think of all the stuff a blood cell does. Carries oxygen around your body, picks up carbon dioxide and other waste. That cell is performing an activity, and we need that in order to be alive. Okay? So every cell is enclosed in a membrane. It's like a gate. It allows some things to go out and some things to come in. But it keeps things in as well. You don't want your organisms squeezing out. You want them to stay inside. And there's some things you don't want inside of a cell. So that's what the membrane does. It's like the gate and allows some things in and some things out. Okay. Now, when we're talking about cells, most of the time we talk about cells, we're going to talk about eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells are true cells. They're the larger ones. They have a nucleus. They have organelles. They're like us, And most organisms that we see or we think about are eukaryotes. In other words, they're true cells. Okay, there's also a prokaryotic cell, and there's actually way more prokaryotic cells than eukaryotic cells. They're very tiny. Actually, the inside of a cell, the organelles are about the size of a prokaryotic cell. So they're very tiny. Prokaryote cells don't have a nucleus. They do have DNA, but they don't have a nucleus and they don't have organelles. They're really tiny. And again, your example of a prokaryotic cell is going to be bacteria. Here's a eukaryotic cell. You got the big nucleus. Here's your membrane. This is an animal cell. You can tell because it's round. Plant cells are like bricks. Okay, but we'll talk about all these parts later. But this is, you can see this under a regular microscope. You don't need anything fancy to see it. And you can actually see some of the organelles. Not all of them, but you can see quite a few. And your DNA right there in the nucleus. Okay, here's a prokaryotic cell. If you went back here and took like this, that's about the size of a prokaryotic cell. So you can put several prokaryotic cells inside of a eukaryotic cell. They're just tiny, okay? They have DNA, but they don't have any organized nucleus and they don't have any organelles. Okay, so another theme is, how do we get, when we're talking about life, how do we get this information transferred from generation to generation? Okay, so we do that through DNA. Okay, within your cells, you have chromosomes. You guys probably remember those from biology when you were in high school. Chromosomes look like little X's, and humans have 46 little X's, 23 from Ma, 23 from Pa. And what a chromosome is, it's a protein called chromatid, which holds it together, and then DNA strands. And the DNA is the code. It's a blueprint to build you. The fact that you have 2 arms and that you have legs and that you have 2 eyeballs and a nose and everything about you is in that DNA. That's where you were built from, is from that information. Okay? So genetic material, each chromosome is one long DNA molecule with hundreds and thousands of genes, depending on the size of the chromosome. Genes, what a gene is a piece of DNA. And it has a code. And it might be the code for building proteins in your digestive system, your enzymes. It might be the one that builds your eyeball. You know, you have these genes, and you have obviously, if you think about all the characteristics of humans, we have a lot of genes. So we need this information to rebuild us. Okay? They're the units of inheritance. And the DNA is what the inheritance comes from. Its job is to, first of all, build you, and then control your development and make sure that you maintain your structures. If you damage your muscle, well, DNA is going to have the information to fix that muscle. Okay? And here to give you an idea, so we start egg cell, and this has 23 chromosomes, this has 23 chromosomes. Put those 2 together, and then you have a fertilized egg, which is called a zygote. So 23 from mom, 23 from dad, and then it starts dividing. And after 9 months, here you go. You have a combination from 2 individuals. Half the chromosomes here, half the chromosomes here, and now you have it. And when I say chromosome, looks all squiggly. That's what it normally looks like. When a cell's ready to divide, it will coil down, and that's when you'll get your little chromosome, the little X's that'll line up. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about mitosis and meiosis. Okay? And again, each DNA molecule is made up of 2 long chains called a double helix. I think we're going to quit here because I only got about a minute left, and I don't want to get into DNA and have to cut you off. So we'll talk more about DNA when we get to the next part of this lecture. So now that we're done with part 1, what I want you to do is, there'll be some questions for you to do. You do that part, and then you move on to the next part. It'll probably take us 3 videos, I guess, to get through the first chapter. Okay, and again, if you have any questions, let me know. I hope you enjoy my narrative. If you don't, sorry, but that's the way it goes. All right, so again, make sure you do your discussion questions or your quiz after this, and then we'll move on to the next part.